what is that game that's giving you a script? Well, the queer person takes the script and says, this does not sound like me, and throws it away. And in that throwing it away, they unleash shackles from even their heterosexual friends.
Welcome to Communion and Shalom.
In this podcast, we are exploring how the biblical and historic Christian faith can engage sexuality, ethnicity, culture, and our local communities as we pursue the flourishing of God's kingdom. Our goal is to engage these topics charitably and with nuance.
Hello, friends. Today we have an episode that I hope y'all will find interesting. We are joined by our friends, who you'll meet in just a minute, and we end up exploring how we think about the word queer, how it relates to sexual orientation, and even just the witness of Christian truth in general. Towards the end of the episode, TJ and I further explore different ways to think about the question of whether sexual orientation or queerness is in any way, quote-unquote, ontological. Ontology studies the nature of being. So in this question, we are evaluating how being same-sex attracted or queer relates to someone's being or personhood, whether it is either essential or inherent to someone's personhood. If you end up finding this conversation interesting, we invite you to join our Patreon community to further support this podcast. Enjoy the episode. Hello, everybody. I'm so glad to have us together. Will and Michelle, welcome for your very first time to Communion and Shalom. We are super glad to have you guys on as kind of guests today. Often we've had people along more so to specifically interview them. And we did have that in mind until life on side B kind of beat us to the punch a little bit and got a great interview in with you guys. And so I thought, well, rather than doing another kind of just life interview, maybe we can invite them into more of a topical discussion, which of course we'll still bring into our own lives and stories and such into it.
Perfect.
Will, Michelle, can you guys just briefly introduce yourselves?
So I'm Michelle. I'm from Texas. I love to create art and to write. I do a little bit of journalism, and then I work as a content writer full time. So I'm super excited to be here.
And I'm Will. I identify as ace or asexual, and I find myself within the liturgical traditions of Christianity, which is kind of a fun place to be. Right now I'm living in Texas, about to move to South Bend, and my day job is working as a marketing director for a software company. For fun, I like to read philosophy and ethics and humanities and that kind of fun stuff.
Cool. So I first met Will and Michelle when I was down at Revoice last year, and they so graciously hosted me and a few other friends, and we had just a blast of a weekend together. And I was really impressed just with their general thoughtfulness, as well as, kindness, hospitality, their friendship's beautiful, lots of things I love about Will and Michelle, but specifically bringing them into this episode because of how thoughtful they are. So
after Revoice, the first thing David Frank told me was that you need to be friends with Will and Michelle.
Oh my god,
that was the first thing he said.
Sweet.
So yeah, he was definitely very happy to meet you.
Oh, well, we were happy to meet you too. It was so much fun.
We loved having you.
It was super fun.
Yeah, and I'm excited about you coming to the Midwest, and hopefully that'll mean we get to see each other face to face sometime in the future.
I hope so.
So today's topic, TJ and I have been thinking through a lot of different questions, and the question at hand is about, while a lot of Christians often only think of queerness or queer sexual orientation in kind of negative terms, just in what's the baggage or the sin that it relates to, we wanted to ask, what goods might we discern in being queer, even through all these complexities of that experience? What is there that we can discern, even if we also may discern disordered aspect or feature of it as well? So we could take the big analytical view of groups, okay, gay men, I think they're statistically more involved in the arts than straight men. So does that say something about what it means to be gay? And intrinsic in these kind of questions is an understanding that people often experience their queerness or gayness in a way that affects more than just what sexual temptations they deal or don't deal with. So while some people might be offended by the tight definition of gayness associating it with sin, other people are really confused by any talk of queerness and its goods.
Mm-hmm.
So rather than focusing on the statistical kind of group analysis, we did want to have a discussion that's more personal about how these things have emerged in our own lives, which is why we got TJ, Will, Michelle, and myself here. But before we even go into that discussion, I think part one discussion is, what does it even mean to be queer? Because I mean, one of my first memories of that word queer, I was driving in a car with my grandpa, and he looks up in the sky, points at a cloud, and says, "That's a queer cloud." And I was like, "Grandpa!" And at that point, I thought queer was like this bad word, because actually maybe my memory before that was playing Smear the Queer in elementary school, which I don't think I knew what queer meant. It was just like the person who caught the football was the person you were supposed to tackle. They were the odd one out, which in some sense is the most basic definition of queer. It's the weird one, the odd one out. But it probably came from more of a homophobia background, I'm guessing, is where that...
I don't know, because in English-speaking Africa, which is usually British, they still use queer to mean weird.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's the older definition. I think they retained that definition that was older, but queer became sort of meaning homosexual or whatever in U.S. English. I don't know the history, but I think it's changed over time.
What has been some of your own experiences or development with what that word is, what it means to you socially and personally?
I think it's a really unique word just because there is so much back history with it being a very negative thing and people having to like reclaim it and to be a positive thing. And still, certain people have different opinions on it even today. Some people are all for it. Some people aren't. Some people identify with it. Some people don't. I think it's very interesting that it isn't just this. It's not completely synonymous with gay. If you are gay, you are not necessarily queer because you might not just want to be considered that. I'm very new to the LGBTQ scene. I realized that I was asexual about a year and a half, 2 years ago, and queer is something that's always made a lot of sense for me in my experience. Simply because, for me, I think being asexual but hetero-romantic, I think that's probably a little closer to heterosexuality than some of the other types of LGBTQ experiences. And so it's a very nice word in my experience that does designate a little weird, having different opinions on things, different types of experiences. And I think that's a beautiful way when people want to embrace that and want to use it to explain their differences and their different ways of engaging with the world and how the world has engaged with them through their queerness. I think it's also very nice that it brings a certain unity to an LGBTQ queer experience. It's a very unitive word that just means something a little different. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think that's why I first liked it. As like, oh, my grandpa thought that was a weird cloud. I'm kind of weird. I can associate with that. And especially in like, what words do best describe, my sexual or romantic or aesthetic, etc. orientations, that it's like, maybe I don't need to be specific. Maybe I can keep it vague.
Yeah. I love the example of your grandfather because he probably wasn't like, oh, that's a weird cloud in a very negative way. It was simply it's queer, it's different, it's unique. The end. That's probably, tell me if I'm wrong, all he meant by it. It didn't have to be a negative thing. It just is a different way of being in the world. And that's identifiable to other people. Your grandfather, he was able to identify that. He was able to see it enough to mention it to you and to point it out to you.
Yeah, I mean, my first reaction is, it's kind of hard to put dates and times on specific like words as they change, kind of like you're saying, TJ. I mean, obviously in some UK English, a faggot could refer to a cigarette or like sticks that you might put in a fire, like kindling. So it's kind of funny because it's a little hard to say when language shifts. But I would say, if we're going to be talking about early on in Christianity, there is a whole lot of like kind of being a little bit imprecise with language for the sake of some sort of gospel-y end, or for for the sake of understanding the kingdom as it was meant to be. So for instance, one of my favorite church fathers is this guy named Origen. So he's writing very early on in the church's history. And so he has this whole kind of apologetic against this other pagan writer who's like, oh, the Christians are bad. They don't have all the same stuff. They don't have the features of our religions. And one of the things that's brought up is one of the arguments against Christianity is it's not really a full-fledged religion. It's just some kind of weird little offshoot cult thing, because it doesn't have the kind of like weirdness of the initiatory secret religions of the Greek and Roman time. And Origen's like, that's wrong. Actually, Christianity's better because it's like the weirdest kind of secret, sort of almost Gnostic sect that you can find. And so his argument for Christianity is that it's weird, right? If you're talking about something that has these like kind of secret esoteric knowledges and they do weird things like call each other brother and sister, and then there's this like eating of flesh and drinking of blood, and there are like these angels and hierarchies and sacrifice, but it's secret and it's underground. He's like, well, actually Christianity is the most weird religion. So if you want to play that game, we win, right? Yeah. But there's also, to bring it to something a little bit more relevant, there is sort of this kind of weird language that kind of doesn't always fit how we might think of things in terms of our natural maybe inclination. So for instance, I believe it's Pope Gregory, so one of these early bishops of the church as well, who's talking to this group of consecrated virgins. So people who are obviously not, getting married, engaging in sexual intercourse, having kids. But what he says to them is, you are more like the image, the form, the type of woman Mary was, right, who had the virgin birth, than actual mothers, like people who give birth. Like he's saying, you're more like the prime type of what a mother is, in you having spiritually giving life to people through your service to the church. Then there's actually this interesting early Franciscan. So we're talking about like 15th century now at this point. I think his name is Salambane, and his brothers go off and join monasteries and become priests and live these celibate lifestyles. And he's like the youngest of these brothers. And so his father is kind of like, okay, well, I've really got to make sure this guy settles down and finds someone for the inheritance, because all these other guys have gone off to like serve the church. And it turns out Salambane is enraptured by the message of Francis of Assisi and tries to become a Franciscan. His father tries to hunt him down, and they have this theological debate. And so one of the things his father tells him is, you have to be the one to pass on our family line. And Salambane is like, you know what? You remember how Jesus says, don't lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, but treasures in heaven? Through my work and ministry, I'm going to give you so many spiritual, heavenly children. So another example of this kind of weird Christian thing where we take some definitions and turn them on their head. Now, I picked two examples, Salambane and the consecrated virgins, because it relates to the issue that we're talking about, sexuality, right? So there's this weird sense in which there are these women out there who aren't giving birth to children and are more like mothers. There's this celibate Franciscan friar who, of course, is also celibate, not having kids or whatever. And he's having this whole heaven full thing of children. And yet that is described in some way as more like this final fulfilled version of like sexuality in some ways. And so it's like, if there is a queering that's happening, I think this happens with more than just, zine culture in the 70s and 80s or things like that, or after Stonewall and other stuff. But I feel like Christianity does this kind of turn things on your head thing with language much earlier, just not that long after Christ, for instance. I don't know, I've been talking a lot.
And actually, I think our friend, Dr. Catherine, she wrote a paper in a queer theory course. When she was at Harvard, she basically wrote exactly what you were saying, Will, where she was looking at these monastic women.
Anchorites, right?
Yeah, Anchorites, very cloistered, very separated, even often from kind of each other, just really dedicated in prayer. And her paper was in a queer literature class, and she was writing of saying, these women queered sexuality and the norms of society better than modern LGBTQ community, essentially. And so like our modern community should be looking back at them in order to like better kind of queer cultural norms. And her prof was like, you should actually like make your ending even stronger. She was really supportive of the argument in the paper. And I think that is interesting. It feels paradoxical to me of it's queering norms, but as you said, they're actually more exhibiting that like motherly spirit that is like born into us in the image of God than merely biological reproduction. And so it's subverting it, but it's also supporting the most foundational essence, right? It's like subverting it for the point of pointing it back to its core.
Yes.
Is that a way of saying it?
I think so, right? Because what that's sort of saying in one way is, what is the core, right? Like what is that, whether we're talking about sexual reproduction or like sexual intimacy, sexual intercourse, whatever, like what we're talking about is the fact that we have this weird dilemma that we have bodies, and not just that we have bodies, but that we have sexed bodies, right? So like, what does that mean for us, right?
Yeah, and which is kind of my next thought is like, how much does that map onto what you guys know or have experienced with queer theory? Often more in the academies, and my little exposure to it is that there's at least certain branches of queer theory that they want to queer any norm to the point of destroying it. Like it's not so it can like return to its more original essence. The only essence that they might want to support, at least this one author I was reading, is just the absolute, just like be present in the moment and care for those who you're like direct in connection to, but don't try to create any meaning that, you know, directs you into the future, because creating any norms that are built upon those like plans for the future will end up creating oppression, I think was the general flow of their thought. Feels a little nihilist to me, but it really saw all cultural and social norms as inevitably leading to oppression. And that's different. There's a norm of what it means to be a mother, even if it may work itself out differently biologically and spiritually, etc. There are still certain norms that are being supported.
The queer theorists I know are usually skeptical of any meta-narrative, like any larger story that talks about ends of types, ends of people, ends of groups. It's kind of individualistic ultimately, but anything beyond just the small stories are oppressive to others. And they don't allow authentic humanness to emerge or something like that.
When I mentioned earlier, you know, that kind of association of like gay men with the arts or theater or something, and I found a little editorial titled, "Why is Theater So Queer?" And here's this little quote from it. "The practice of performance itself is not in the least queer, given that it has absolutely nothing to do with sexuality or gender. Theater and the arts are neither masculine nor feminine. They just are. They form an important part of our overarching culture and are therefore open to all. And it is precisely that openness, in my opinion, that attracts the queer community." And what you were describing, Michelle, makes me just think of that, like, by having this, by just fronting the like, oh, the weirdness, the oddness, has given permission for people to say, yeah, I don't know, I don't feel like I always fit in with the kind of typical talk that's going around me or the typical experiences in these certain types of situations. And so it's created that like invitation to be open, to be honest about those things.
I love that. Theater and the arts in general, it's such a beautiful like gateway for people to express themselves and their experiences of the world, and to like tell stories of other people and other places. And I think it's beautiful that people in general gravitate towards that. I think it's especially beautiful that people who have these unique experiences within life growing up and experiencing other people and other people experiencing them, I think it's beautiful that these queer people are drawn to something that's so expressive in that. I think that's really, really just a gorgeous way of being a human being. And not to say that, if you're some kind of queer and you were never drawn to the arts, it's like a negative thing. But I think it's very cool that so many people are.
So I've been describing queer to people that I talk with, and this is the way I'm currently thinking about it: an unusual and maybe special attraction or affection for the same sex. And Elena, who's our project manager, her first reaction was, that's like too general. But I liked it because I'm trying to encapsulate, some people have sexual attraction, right, towards the same sex, we might label queer. Some people have predominantly romantic attraction. Some people have mixed, like, as you said, like, as we've realized, I think in our conversation now and in the past, it can be complex for some people, right?
I think it's great. I think the generalness kind of helps the direction of openness, like what David was saying about the arts. Like, there isn't anything special or different out of the ordinary of expressing oneself. That's kind of one way of being human, right? But what is a little bit different is that permission, right? Even though it's human to act out, to be bigger than one is, to be heroic, to be dramatic and expressive, we're not always given that permission, right? And so what I think is super interesting about the idea of queerness being something more like a special kind of attraction, it could be sexual, it could be something else, to people of the same sex, is that it kind of deconstructs what I like to call the game, because I can't think of another way to describe it. So like the game is this kind of the heterosexual norm game, right?
Yeah.
When somebody's 30 years old and this little boy like pats a little girl in the head, it's like, oh, they're so cute, they'd be a great couple. It's like there's nothing coded in that interaction that should lead to what I call the game. You grow up, you're supposed to date, you're supposed to go places and pick up chicks, you're supposed to do this, supposed to do that, you're supposed to go out with people, and it's supposed to be a chase, it's supposed to be sometimes conquest, it's supposed to be competitive sometimes. And I realize that there could be a beautiful side to that, and I'm kind of telling only one part of the story for a specific reason. And the reason is, unfortunately, the game as it's played becomes something like its own religion. Right. And that's why when it comes to openness and this idea of queer that you're bringing up, TJ, I think that queerness helps in a reset. Right.
True.
What's the reset? Well, the game that's encoded in the way that a little boy interacts with a little girl, or what you are, quote unquote, supposed to do when you hang out with someone of the opposite sex and you're single or available. Right. Can I make it any more obvious? In the words of Avril Lavigne, what is obvious there? What is that game that's giving you a script? Well, the queer person takes the script and says, "This does not sound like me," and throws it away. And in that throwing it away, they unleash shackles from even like their heterosexual friends. It's like, oh,
Definitely.
wait. When I hang out, if I'm a man, when I hang out with women, my end goal here isn't to like attract them to then date them, as if the end goal of my interaction with them is to like date, whatever the heck that means. Sorry, I don't know what your language rules are in this podcast, but whatever that means, right? But again, like it's the game. And without sounding too much of this deconstruction thing that I think you were giving a helpful critique of, TJ, obviously we can't just like that this big scary, a specter haunts the US and that specter is the game. But like there is this underlying set of norms that does not lead to our full integration of people because it does not have openness towards the self at its core.
Yes.
And I think that's deeply theological. So I really love the Ignatian spiritual tradition. And there's this really key part of it that we might call autognosis, self-knowledge. And the thought behind that is this: the end goal for Christians, one way of putting the end goal, is theosis, this fun, interesting word that basically means the transformation of people into what we were meant to be. And it's theosis, like related to God, because we were meant to be something more like what Christ is, this perfected human being. So as one of the patristics again said it, Christ became a human, so human could become like Christ. God became man, so man could become God, which is sort of scandalous, I think. sort of
Mhm.
scandalous to say it that way, because that's like, wow, that's saying a lot about human beings and our potential. Yeah, it sure as heck is, because Jesus Christ, the second person of the Trinity, takes on human form, is still the icon of the Father, as Paul tells us, right? Is still the icon of the Father, and yet maintains what we think of as broken, kind of irredeemable, kind of annoying, aches and pains human flesh. Why would you, being the perfected second member of the Trinity, ever do such a thing? What a waste. Well, no. There's so much potential in that humanness that
Mhm.
literally the second person of the progenitor of all creation was like, I want that as a part of my being. Weird,
Mm.
crazy, huh? But it's like that, but that openness that Christ has, what Paul tells us in Philippians, he did not consider it equality with God as something to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking on the form of a servant, right?
Mhm.
It's like that emptying is what leads, I think, to that openness. Through that emptying, as we read from the writer of Hebrews, is how he learned obedience, which is, again, sort of a scandalous thing to say. Like, what does Christ need to learn? Well, we could ask the writer of Hebrews when we get to heaven, because it's weird. But you see my point. It's just like that. Back to autognosis, right? So Christ is able to learn something about the self and something about being through that living into something, right? And not
Mm.
just that, but as a human being, when I do autognosis, when I do self-knowledge, that isn't just revealing myself to myself, because that feels like that would be a little bit kind of selfish. No, but it's
Mhm.
something more because of what God has done for us. Just as Christ redeemed something about the human body by taking it on and then resurrecting and taking that perfected human body with him, there is something that I am awaiting in my body now, that when I contemplate what it means to be loved by God, a Christian unified to Christ with the Spirit dwelling in me, this sounds scandalous as well, but wait for it. When I take time to know myself and integrate with myself, it isn't just with myself, it's with God. So when I take time to learn about myself, I'm also learning many things about God. When I'm integrating with myself, I'm also integrating myself in many ways with God.
I was going to say, my small group had been reading On the Incarnation by Athanasius.
Yes.
He hits so well as you kind of continue to read through it of this revelation of God as it's born up in us being image bearers, and how
Yes.
Christ taking on our flesh, being incarnated, is just this double affirmation of truly this is the way that God has wanted us, his creation, to know him. It's actually like
Yes.
part of it's bound up in what it means to be human.
Absolutely.
And it's this just profound, like, I think it makes so much sense. I think really simple ways people have like, oh yeah, if you have a bad relationship with your father, it's going to disrupt your ability to know Father God in a certain way. And you can have that Father God relationship, kind of work this redemptive way of like, oh, this is what it means to be a father. Now I can reapproach my own father or learn how to be a father. But it's that self-knowledge and God knowledge are designed to be tied up together.
Yes. Yeah.
And well, it's different from, I think, certain older kind of, well, I guess you could say Gnostic traditions that really distance themselves from human flesh, and other ones that are like, okay, let's transcend reality. Let's leave, all this dirt and just get this more abstract knowledge of God. But Christianity is very embodied. Like, no, we're going to get to know God through our bodies, and as Jesus says, like even through suffering. This like difficult of human experience, which is more complicated. But in contrast to, there is Gnosticism in our current culture, but I think where some people might be reacting to some of the ways that people pursue queer culture is that it's coming out of a lot of expressive individualism that is not just self-knowing, but of like self-creating. And especially I think it's a lot of youth are finding this difficulty of like, oh, who am I? And they don't go to look back at, oh, who are my parents? What's my family? Who is my community? Like, what are all the things that have been bound up? But it's like, no, you need to create that out of nothing. You need to do some ex nihilo self-creation and call that queerness. And so that seems to be that more like destructive queerness that's but then people are still trying to find their like personal identities, and it feels like grasping at straws, versus a queerness which helps us like kind of clear away some of the like extra layers that have been built up. They're like, oh, maybe they are helpful in some ways, but also we need to peel it back a little bit and see what else is in there. And that's where that openness to our experiences and seeing like, oh, how is God meeting us in both the particularities that we share of like, what does it mean to like live in family and community, to live in dependency on the land, but then also the particularities of me.
Yeah.
And it's just crazy how different everybody is, like all the different things. And you're like, oh, that person loves, maybe digging in a way that like reminds me of God's love of the earth. And then this person loves singing in a way that reminds me of God's, how he just, breathes beauty into the air and brings our souls together.
That's why I think art is so important, because I've always seen it as like there's three main aspects for something to truly be like real art. I think there has to be maybe not a full integration of the self, but there has to be self-knowledge. Like you have to be able to take yourself and try to find yourself and to like grasp that and to exude that into your art. And there also has to be a community aspect to art. You're not just getting it out of nowhere, like you were saying. It has to be, in a good sense, reactive to what's going on. It has to be connected to your experience, which is not just yourself in the middle of nowhere. It is you within a society, whether that's the negatives or the positives, or your family or your community. It has to be connected to what's around you, the rest of creation. And then there also has to be that aspect of communion with God. Maybe you don't know God, but with God as the good, the philosophical, like highest being. There has to be that pull of self that we talked about before with what's around you, and pulling that out and up towards God for it to be like true art. And that's why, someone might really love digging and they might be really good at it, and that is an art, and that can lead people towards Christ. Or perhaps they're really good at painting. And when you look at their art, you can see in their art style, like, I know who that person is. I see their soul through their style of art. And I also see their experiences because of what they're painting. I see the types of communities that they came from. I see, the colors that stood out to them and the contrast between this and that. And you're also going to see their push towards the good through their creation of that, through their hope and their desperation to move themselves towards this goal of creating this art and this self-expression. So that's another reason why I think it's really cool that like queer people tend to be really into like the arts. I think that's a really good just sign of what's going on in queer communities, that is something that we're like being drawn to.
I hope we can delve more in the future on this question of what is queerness. And I don't know. I'm a social scientist by background, so I really like comparative perspectives as well. So I think we will in the future, but I want to talk more about like queerness in other contexts, because the queerness of the US, it looks different than like the queerness in Africa. I've lived all my life in Africa, and even in the queerness in like Mexico, which I've also lived there. So I hope we just delve into that more and more. Also, something else, what we originally touched in the beginning, I think ontology, like whatever ontology is, ontology can only be seen in human life through like a developed situation, a developed script, a developed way of thinking, a phenomena, a social cultural formation. I don't know if human beings can ever see ontology in this age with normal human knowledge. Does that make sense? I don't know if that makes sense, but it can't be like...
It does.
Yes.
We don't perceive the phenomena directly, essentially. And we can only perceive the phenomena through mediating force structures or forces or something like that.
Absolutely.
When we think about like gender roles, I have an ambivalent relationship to them in that I think human beings have to have them because we can't get to the ontological bareness, right? But the question is, sometimes they're too much. And maybe this is golden mean. Sometimes they're too much. Like they're too much in a way that it seems to inhibit authentic human flourishing somehow. But sometimes maybe they're too little. Maybe that's also conceivably that could be possible, I guess.
Yeah.
Even if it doesn't happen that much, I don't know. Those are my thoughts. Hopefully we can continue the conversation on those questions or related questions. But yeah, I just hope we keep developing this, because I think some of these, like tracing out the architecture of our intellectual ideas and the frameworks, I think could help the conversation in general for side B people or queer Christians thinking about some of these topics.
Any final thoughts from any of y'all fine people just on queerness, its relation to life, faith, community?
I think a lot of places will tell you that it's okay to be gay and it's okay to be straight. It's all fine. It's all just neutral, and what we do with it is where we get the goods. But I think it's good to be gay. I think it's good to be queer, and I think it's good to be straight. And I think those are important aspects that make us who we are, or a part of who we are already. I think there's so much beauty that comes from those things that we sometimes, like say that the fruits of it is what is really good. But I think there's so much beauty and goodness to just ontologically, to being gay, to being queer, and to being straight. I think there's so much to learn from all these different ways of living in the world.
Michelle, you talked about the goodness of straightness, and that is not actually often said. It's either assumed in kind of a toxic game playing way, that assumption of like, this is everyone's experience, that makes it so like difficult to deal with. They can't even name what their experience is like often, and how it might be different from other people. But then actually being able to name it and really see like, what has God designed here? What is going on here that is really great. And I think that if we're able to do both those things, of say, hey, here's the goods that come out of not being straight, and here are the beautiful goods of God's created straightness, then we're actually able to allow people to have that, as you said earlier, Will, self-gnosis. Like, how can I know myself and in that know God more, and not be funneled either into the game or funneled into the new queer game of like, I got to be queer to be cool. And I think that is, just a whole nother set of dangers. You have repeatedly said so well, become more like Christ. That ultimately all this queering is for the sake of getting closer to Christ. And I think I've seen even Christian queer work that has used Christ in order to queer things. In my Bible verse bashing days, I did it in a different way. How can I use Bible verses and Jesus to just to show that I'm right in this way? In so many ways, we can distort what Jesus is trying to lead us into. It's really what will ultimately just be this marriage supper of the Lamb, right? Like us all coming together as the bride of Christ, knowing Christ more intimately than we can ever imagine. Yeah. So thank you, Michelle.
Thank you. That was beautiful.
That was well put.
Very.
It has been a few weeks since we recorded this episode with Will and Michelle, and TJ and I have been continuing to think about these different takes on what queer means, whether there is a more ontological bent to it, or whether it is more of a social, political, cultural force. In a different part of our conversation with Will and Michelle, which will be released in an upcoming episode, we talked about some of the gifts of being queer that we have experienced in our lives. If we consider queer sexuality from an ontological bent, it will always be worked out in one's cultural context, but there might be something more that transcends merely a social cultural dynamic. So, TJ, can you kick us off some thoughts on how we might think about this ontology with queer?
Yeah, definitely. So ontology is about the study of being. So there's a question, in the way we're using it, there's a question of how we're using it exactly. Because in some sense, queerness, it could be inherent, like there's an inherentness, or are we talking about the essence? For example, is being queer the essence of myself, like TJ, or the essence of TJ? That could be one way of thinking about it, is that ontology of being queer, like the essence of myself. Did God create me to be queer? You might ask, right? Or you could ask, is queer something that's inherent to me, but it's not necessarily my essence? For example, I've been queer as long as I can remember, right? When I first started having, even before I had sexual desire, I seemed to have a special connection with other people of the same sex. And that could have happened just because perhaps there's a biological nature to it. Maybe I developed differently in my mother's womb. Maybe my brain wiring shifted for some reason that is not understandable, either because of environmental, biological, social, like some sort of confluence of all those different areas.
So the latter would be kind of like, okay, you have, brown hair.
Yes.
And that's inherent to you, but it's not necessarily like if you bleach your hair, that's not going to like change the essence of who TJ is.
You're quite right.
And so that former part of like this ontological essence hits more at what I think, especially maybe some older school thought on like the use of the word identity. Mm-hmm. It's trying to like identity, like first tier identity. What is that core of who I am that is kind of unchanging and thus needs to be rooted in like, pure goods, untainted things. It's almost like the pre-fall who we are.
You're correct. I think the same way. And just as a side note, we'll talk about this, I think, in a different episode. But I think thinking about queerness as like an essence often leads to a more positive perspective of what queerness could be. But if you think about it as inherent, and especially if you use ideas of brokenness, it usually produces a more negative perspective of what queerness is.
Yeah, because you could have inherent things that are good about you, and you could have inherent things that are broken and corrupted and affected by sin.
Yeah, so it could be, and I don't think we can prove this, I'll just say, like, this is speculative theology or speculative reflection, right? I don't think we can make definite evidence for either necessarily. So it could be queer, something that's inherent. The idea would be, I experienced this because of the general corruption of the world, because of sin. So somehow I developed in a way that's somehow broken or disordered, right? But if we say it's from my essence, maybe God made me to have a special affinity for people of the same sex. That's just his desire, right? So for me as a person.
Maybe state that definition again of like, you've been trying to think about queerness.
Mm-hmm.
How would you define that?
So the definition I'm currently playing with or trying to investigate as seeing how useful it is that queerness is a special affinity for someone of the same sex. That's what a person who's queer, that's what we mean. Sometimes for some people, maybe a lot of people, that often leads to sexual desire, which as Christians we think is disordered somehow, right? But for other people, if you're an asexual person, you may be mostly attracted to people of the same sex, so maybe there's no sexual desire involved in that, right? And I think this definition can even work for potentially, this is a big question mark over this, but potentially people who, well, we call them heterosexual because they're mostly desire sex with people of the opposite sex. A lot of their other social, emotional, mental energy is desiring people of the same sex, right? And I would probably have to unpack this because it's still a question, would that be labeled as queer the way we typically use it? Because oftentimes when we talk about queer in contemporary English, it seems to be there's a necessary component of that is same-sex sexual desire, right? The exception may be queer ace people, but I think that's a pretty common part of it, I think, for what queer is as describing a person.
For queer sexuality, we are also beginning to see queer work out as a larger umbrella of gender queerness versus just sexual orientation queerness.
Yeah, it's a good point.
And that's where I think, just at least, culturally, we are using queer actually closer to its original meaning of weird. Like something that's weird, that's different. And I think as far as that word goes, I'm more comfortable with it as this broad umbrella, which leads me into maybe a different question. Queer has become this umbrella that even like Michelle has found a home underneath, but she's asexual but heteroromantic. Like she still desires a kind of romantic or intimate connection with someone of the opposite sex, but isn't interested in actual sexual relationships, making a family in that kind of traditional way. And so that would kind of potentially push her outside of the umbrella of queer. I'm happy to I like there being a home for people.
Yeah.
But sticking with kind of your paradigm of like if queer is not quite gay, in which we might associate with being solely attracted to members of the same sex, but it could include people who are bi or anywhere in that kind of range of like, you notice something different about the way that they have a affinity towards members of the same sex.
Yeah.
That could in a broken way be sexual orientation, that could include more just romantic or social dynamics or bonds of friendship and partnership that seem to stand out from other people.
Yes.
And I think that's really interesting. I think I first came across that with Wesley Hill on spiritual friendship, where he's...
In his book, right?
Oh, I was thinking about the blog, that maybe something he was writing about, but it could have also been a different writer.
Mm-hmm.
What's this, affinity? Could there be an affinity for friendship that is unique to some people that got corrupted by the fall? My hesitancy with that is over distinguishing, like, oh, there's the queer people who care about friendship and the straight people who don't, where actually like friendship is a human norm. Yeah. And so I think that's why I like talking about queering as subverting messed up cultural setups where we've created overly platonic, not deep friendships. And so queer people in this moment have the opportunity to kind of like say, hey, it doesn't have to be that way. We can have meaningful friendships outside of, typical, how you think, romantic relationships. But I understand where if you're only in that cultural dynamic, I think you're really trying to push back against people just only seeing things through the lens of sin.
Yeah, I definitely am. I definitely want to say you and I were interested in the same ethical political project where we expand the imagination of what's possible for faithful Christian life, right? And we do break apart, deconstruct the idols that people have made. I think we're definitely together on that. But my question is, when we talk about someone being queer, I think there's multiple definitions of being queer, obviously. But I think one is that challenging dominant norms.
Yeah, and we talked about, well, why is it that gay men tend to be more involved in musical theater? And it hits at, if you start stacking up a bunch of things that are inherently connected to a group of people, it seems to beg that question of, oh, is there some type of essential core?
Yeah, you're right.
In the same way that, it's like we very clearly have this differentiation between male and female in our bodies because of our belief in the image of God, that there's something essential about who we are, that while sex and marriage may go away, there's nothing to imply that the male and female doesn't continue on into eternity, that this is something essential to who we are.
Yeah.
I think about what are ways that we might just think about different personality types? We think, that person is just more introverted and extroverted. Should everybody have alone time and everybody have social time? Yes. Just because we create these categories and say, maybe that's actually connected to something pretty deep down in their identity, in who they are, that doesn't mean that they're, somehow accepted from human norms.
I agree. 100%.
I think we're in just full agreement that even if there is this potential of, a queer type of person in your definition of someone who has these unique same-sex inclinations and affinities, that doesn't mean they're they're not accepted from the human template of bearing the image of God.
Not at all.
Which is why we uphold still like God's design for marriage and sexual intercourse as not being changed by this. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what maybe a lot of people find difficult. They think, if some essential part of you ontologically is queer, is oriented towards the same sex, then we need to change our ethical categories.
They do think that, yeah. That seems to be a common argument, at least. This is what I try to do. Simultaneously, I hold that queer people, I think, are different in some respect that's relevant, right? And even inherently or ontologically somehow, but I don't know which one. I don't know how to parse that. I want to hold to both that queerness people are different, have different experiences somehow, right? And there's a lot more parsing out that needs to happen. But also simultaneously, I hold that God has an intention for marriage and sex. And I think you can hold those two things at the same time, even though I admit there's complexity in holding the same two. And that's part of what our podcast is about, that complexity on this topic. So, yeah.
Another just quick thought, maybe in a way that challenges the idea of ontology. People say, it's just a social construction. And I think...
Queerness, that is, right?
Well, I mean, often they'll say this about a lot of stuff. But yeah, specifically queerness. So your queerness, your gayness, your whatever, that's just a social construction. And they use this phrase, just a social construction. And I think you hit at earlier that even gender is, we necessarily, even things that we would say are rooted in our essence and our core, is something that we have to socially construct.
Yeah.
Our whole reality. How would you put words to just describing that relation between ontology and social construct? There can be social constructs which aren't rooted in anything much ontological.
In my opinion, that's true. I mean, we should have a whole nother episode on this, just to say, but like intrinsically, even language is a social construction, right? The very words we use are from social communities, and they form how we perceive the world and what categories we use. So I would say any ontological part of our being, for example, the fact that women bear children, we socially construct ways and norms around that to know how to take care of mothers, what babies should do, what babies should be taught, what tasks others in the household around the mother must do. All of these are social constructions based on a common human reality that women have babies, right? So we can never escape social construction as human beings, because human beings are intrinsically cultural. And I would say for queerness, I'm skeptical of any of the accounts that try to make it only social construction, because in my opinion, queerness, what we call queer, emerges from either that a person has, well, as my definition says, they have a special affinity for people of same sex, and perhaps necessarily they have most of their sexual attractions and desires are oriented towards the same sex. And I think those realities can exist for a person, and then people categorize that in different ways. Queer is obviously contemporary English. Not everyone of all time has used that word. Those are all social constructions. So that's how I think about it. Like there can be the basic facts, but then humans necessarily must build ways of categorizing them, practices, ways of life to engage with that reality. There's not many things human that I think are not socially constructed in some sense, even though if there's something that's real, they shape how the social construction happens, and they resist some constructions and allow others.
Mm-hmm. A common thing that a lot of our generation or age are saying, oh, these ways that we've constructed around gender are, we look and see when in history they were socially constructed. Mm-hmm. Oh, we can see how pink used to be for boys and blue used to be for girls, and then that got shifted by certain marketing. Then they reason to say all gender constructions are these just, really meaningless forms of social construction, just as meaningless as the, assigning of...
Like the colors, the blue and the pink thing.
Yeah. And without saying, well, yeah, that's a pretty trite...
Yeah, that was obviously trite.
...construction. Yeah. And the way that we've constructed around the word homosexual is only a construction that came from the 1800s. Yeah. The idea of sexual orientation is a pretty recent, also late 1800s social construction to think about why people are engaging in same-sex sex and relationships. But we see that even before that social construction, it was part of human life.
Yeah.
Again, do we construct around that just as sin, or are there elements of almost personality?
That's part of the tension or the issue that we're trying to unwrap.
Yeah.
Even as Christians, though, but as Christians who are trying to think maybe more deeply about these topics than a lot of people we engage with, mm-hmm. I think there are still questions that are being worked through. Yeah, from my perspective, we always have social construction. The question is, how do we socially construct ways that are as honoring to God as possible? And there's some that God doesn't mind about. They're called, in theological ethical terms, I think that's called adiaphora, like the thing's indifferent, right? Like God may not mind if, let's say, this is a trite example, but when you greet someone and you shake their hand versus you bow to them versus you do whatever, right? Seemingly, in my opinion, I don't think God minds about that. He probably appreciates showing respect to people who are above you, but the exact mechanism is each cultural community can have different ones, and there's no need to change them, right? Like if you bow or if you shake hands or if you do something else, kneel, that's fine. And there's many more examples, but that's a pretty easy one.
I have a neighbor from Afghanistan, and they asked, when you greet your grandma and grandpa, do you kiss their hand? Because that was, in his culture, the way that you show honor.
Yeah, to them particularly. Yeah, I understand that. Sure.
Sexual orientation, romantic orientation, social orientation, that those things are mapping onto real lived experiences.
Yes.
It's just a matter of how predominant do those ways of understanding ourselves, again, similar to like introversion, extroversion. Mm-hmm. Those are also constructs that we've used to describe our psychology just since the early 1900s. It doesn't mean they're not real, but it also means I almost just want to say, don't take it too seriously.
Yeah, that seems right to me. And I will say, I have to say this. Being queer, it becomes more prominent in Christian contexts where there's only one licit direct sexual channel, right? Marriage. If you're in a context where it's not so relevant, if you have multiple sexual partners and they could be of whatever sex, you may not be categorized in that way, right? It becomes categorized because we put all this energy in one thing. So if you don't meet that one thing easily, then you become a separate category.
It makes me wonder, is that merely just something that we say, oh, it's all fallenness and brokenness? Or is there something that we can separate from the broken aspect and say, oh, that's a corruption of this original, potentially essential good that, while not utterly unique, I'm just wrestling with, like, I don't want to say friendship's only for queer people.
No, not at all.
Because I really want this queering force of Christianity is helping shift cultural expectations or standards or systems in order to return to God's design.
Yeah.
And whether the way that I'm queer is just out of brokenness and fallenness, or there's something essentially good of affinity for friendship, either way, I want to take where I'm at and use it to help push towards God's kingdom, push towards God's design, and encourage, all people, give not straight people hope for community and kinship, as well as expand heterosexuals people, whether they're married or single, and say, you need to be part of the village too.
Yeah.
So I lean more on just engaging in that social dynamic and just like what's the redemptive need right now, and how can I be pushing towards that? And I think as a reformed person, very much just being used to knowing, like, wow, this world is fallen, but God is bringing beauty out of the ashes. He's bringing redemptive movement, not just like in spite of our brokenness, but strangely in our brokenness, shows us the most beautiful love by Jesus dying on the cross. Yeah, I see the value in trying to hold on to what you're imagining of what a pre-fall essential queerness, or some other word.
And I'm not saying I'm saying I want to be open to the possibility that could be true, right? Again, this is speculative. I don't know if we can provide a very, very evidence account that could prove one vision or the other is correct, right? But if we don't think about it theologically, like try to employ our whole imagination redeemed by God to think about this, I think we easily fall into problems because I can see a lot of problems. And if you just think queer people are essentially broken, I think that often it ripples out in social ramifications. Like, you people are a separate category of people, particularly broken. You need to be oppressed. You need to be...
It makes it really difficult for people to talk about being queer without people just thinking you're talking about your sins.
Yes. And at least in my experience, over time, as I've lived my Christian life, for the past, 15 years since I hit puberty or whatever, I've seen that it's way more complex than these simple narratives that we were sometimes taught when we were younger, right? That's been my experience. Not saying all queer people have that experience, but I've had that experience. Like, there's more layers, there's more facets. I see some goods, I see some not good, some evils maybe. And wrestling with that, I think it's our endeavor of this age of the conversation in the church, right? Like, what does this mean? What do we do?
It's really difficult to be trying to think through these things almost like intellectually, theologically, while being very aware that we're not just doing an intellectual project. It's this social cultural project, and we're pushing against people who are overly critical of the queer community, and we're also pushing against people who are trying to draw out really confident ontologies of what it means to be queer or gay in a way that overrides
what we think is God's design, right? Yeah.
So we're working these things out, but also pushing against things, trying to keep our bearings while still exploring and create the space for people to be a little weird, a little different. I kind of wonder if in 50 years, most people are maybe practicing in a more bisexual kind of way in their sexuality, if won't be a certain type of oddness of monogamous heterosexual relationships.
Maybe.
And that will be the queerest thing, kind of like it was for the early church.
Yeah.
They were the weird ones, only sleeping with one spouse, like...
It's possible.
And so the Jesus's way has often been the weirdest way, challenging the cultural norms.
I think still is.
Yeah. We hope you enjoyed this, and we'll enjoy our next conversation with Will and Michelle.
Sounds good. Bye.
Bye. Hey listeners, I want to let you know about the Communion and Shalom Patreon. Joining the Patreon community not only supports this podcast, but gives you the opportunity to listen to bonus content, give input on future episodes, and submit questions for a patron-only Q&A. We're so thankful for the support and encouragement from so many listeners, and we hope that this podcast continues to be meaningful to you.